Welcome, everyone, to what is going to be the last discussion of the War on Terror Film Festival. It's a festival I've had the privilege to co-organize with the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. Before we start, I wanted to say that this festival could not have happened without Lina Alarian, Ali Alarian, and Dr. Sami Alarian. So thanks to the three of you for making such a festival happen. For those who have missed the film that we've just seen, We Are Many, another screening of the film will take place on Thursday, so November 4th, at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And I want to remind everyone also that the videos of the panels are all available and on the film discussions page of the festival website. So this panel, following the film by Amir Amirani, We Are Many, is slightly in a way different than the others because we wanted to end a festival which has lasted a month, a festival where we've seen films on torture, on the hidden wars of the US government, on mass surveillance, on media propaganda, on Guantanamo, on Abu Ghraib, on Iraq, Palestine, Afghanistan, on FBI entrapment and sting operations. We wanted to end this festival with organizers and activists, because even though we believe strongly that films can influence people and help change the way people see the world, the real changes are going to come from grassroots, underground activists. And this discussion was crucial for us to also give a sense of, a lot of the films we've seen were quite dark, and so give a sense of hope to people and to talk about people's power. So before we start, I'm going to quickly introduce tonight's panelists. So I'm very happy to be able to have Amir Amirani, the director of We Are Many, with us. Amir has worked and has directed films for the BBC and Channel 4 on a wide range of subjects across the art, music, history, and politics. And he was most recently co-producer on Coup 53, about the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat to overthrow Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. He's also a voting member of BAFTA, which is the British Academy of Film and Television Arts. We also have with us an old friend, not because of the age, but because I've known you for many years, Phyllis. So Phyllis Bennis, she's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington and also of the Amsterdam-based Transnational Institute. She's a co-founder of the Iraq-Era Anti-War Coalition United for Peace and Justice, and she now serves on the National Board of Jewish Voices for Peace and the board of the Afro-Middle East Center in Joburg. She's authored many books on the topics we are going to talk about tonight. We also have with us Colleen Kelly. She's the co-founder of September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, an organization which works to turn grief into action for peace. I'll remind our viewers that your brother, Colleen, Bill Kelly Jr., was killed at the World Trade Center on September 11th. We also have with us another old friend, Anas Al-Tikriti. Anas is CEO and founder of the Cordoba Foundation. He's former president of the Muslim Association of Britain. He's the vice president of the Stop the War Coalition, and he's the co-chair of 2 Million March in London, which the film talked about a lot. Finally, Sami has gone again. So maybe you've seen Sami for a couple of seconds. So Sami, I'll, I guess, reintroduce Sami when he'll be back with us. So first, I wanted to start with you, Amir. You've made this film that we've had the privilege to watch. We Are Many. The film released was in 2014. The film talks about, I mean, you spend a lot of time in the film talking about February 2003. So when did you decide to make the film? Around sort of which year, and what sort of drove you, and why did you think it was crucial to make such a film at the time?
Yes. Well, firstly, thank you for organizing the festival, and thank you for having the film and for organizing this panel. I decided to make the film about 2 or 3 years after being on the demo. I was on the demo in Berlin. It was a really affecting experience. And it was only when I came back to London and saw the impact that the demonstration had on so many people that I knew who weren't necessarily, activists or political and so on, that I thought that, okay, there's something here that kind of needs excavating. And so a few years later, there was a moment where I was standing in the office in the BBC where I was making a radio program, where I literally just remember thinking, wait a minute, if this thing happened in Berlin where I was, and it happened in New York and London, in London where it was so big, then it must have happened elsewhere. And I started looking into it, and I suddenly realized it was in hundreds of cities. And then there was a moment where I thought this was probably the biggest protest that had ever happened, which I think subsequently statistics and other people, has shown to be the case. And that immediately struck me as being so intriguing, and so kind of marking such a shift, that I thought that as a filmmaker, I was drawn to try to find out about it and tell the story. So in a nutshell, that's and I remember filming the first interview with Tony Benn, who many viewers might know as a leading kind of Labour politician here. And I think at the time he was maybe president of the Stop the War Coalition at the time, or chair of it or something. And Anas will know much better than I will. And we did the interview with him and a few others. I was just dipping my toe into the water, not knowing it was going to take me, 9 years from that date for it to be finally in cinemas, which, And so in 2006, April 2006, I did my first interview, and May 2015, it was in cinemas in the UK. In 2014, it had its festival release, but it changed a little between 2014 and 2015. But in a nutshell, that's the arc of the story.
When you started making the film, did you know straight away what you wanted to say in a way, and what you wanted to tell, what you wanted people to take out of the film?
That's a great question. Really, when I started, I had one goal in mind. Could I find out the backstory of how this protest happened, and tell it? Now, of course, we all know the war happened. So, you could argue that I was telling a story of a failure. I didn't think about it, by the way, in terms of success or failure. It was a big protest. Pulling off that protest was huge. We know the war went ahead, but it still seemed to me a story worth telling. But I didn't realize until I got much more into it, that actually the scope of the film would grow, and it would ultimately, for all sorts of reasons, funding reasons, and just the amount of time it would take, the end of the film, it sort of encapsulated 10 years from 2003, when the protest happened, to 2013, which, as you see in the film, kind of with Syria, so those two bookends, marked the stuff, the start and end of the story. That was not in my mind when I could tell you a little interesting story about that would show why it sort of changed. I had been in Boston interviewing Noam Chomsky, and I was waiting in the train station at Boston to go back to New York. And I like going in. Anytime I see a bookshop, I like to go in. And I went into this bookshop, and there was a book about Tahrir Square. And I opened it and I looked at it, and there was a reference to the people who had protested in Egypt. And long story short, it referred to a movement that had grown there, and the references to protest, the Iraq protest. And suddenly this kind of vista opened in front of me of the connection between what had happened in 2003 and the seeds that were sown for what happened in Cairo. And some of those names I saw in the book, I ended up going and interviewing, the ones that you see in the film. So because the film took so long to make and fundraise and for, it meant that those kinds of unexpected things fell into my lap. Most films don't take 9-10 years to make.
If I may, Frank, if I may come in, because what Amir said makes quite fascinating insights into the making of this film. The fact that ultimately it's a story of a failed attempt to stop a war. We all know, the whole world knows, that the war went ahead and that immense carnage was created as a result. Yet you can't help, when watching especially the first half of the film, but feel a sense of optimism that maybe this somehow worked. I've watched the film since it came out 7 years ago more than 20 times. And every single time I'm gripped by the very same feeling that maybe this time. And that, I think, is, I mean, a lot of credit is due to Amir. But the event itself, I mean, not taking away anything from the effort, the tremendous effort that Amir put into this. And I know a little bit about his struggles in order to bring this to the public. But the event was monumental. The event was historical. What happened was unprecedented. And I'd like to think that we could see it happen again, but it'll take a monumentous effort to replicate what's happened on the 15th of February 2003.
You know, if I could jump in as well here, I think I absolutely agree with what both of you had said, except for the notion that this was, even the effect of this protest was itself a failure. It was a failure to stop the war in Iraq, which was the main goal. So that, yes. But I think if we leave out what happened as a result, which is not only in terms of our movement building issues, the additions at the very end, for people who don't know, one of the last changes in the film of the many was in the credits, where you see contemporary movements from Black Lives Matter to the anti-gun movement in the US, to the environmental justice movements led by Jane Fonda, to the Poor People's Campaign in the US. All of these show a direct correlation to that global movement. And while I do think it's important that we also keep in mind that the war in Afghanistan raged for 20 years as well, we know that that war was designed as a lead-up, as a preparation for the war in Iraq, which had much greater strategic significance for those in power. But there were particular things that made that protest different. When we say it was the largest, part of the reason it was the largest, it was the first time that the internet existed in a way that made it possible to use it to mobilize globally. That had never been possible before 2002, 2003. The internet was brand new. Cell phones were brand new. I remember getting a call backstage on September 11th about something that had just happened at the UN and thinking, what did we do before cell phones? All of a sudden, all these communications were possible. So it was both the first global thing, the first global mobilization that you hear Raffaella Bolini announcing with such passion in Florence, but also that it was the first time that we had a protest that was global in the sense of movements, which were by far the most important component of this new second superpower, but where there were also governments for their own opportunist reasons, let's not have any illusions, but there were important governments that were siding with anti-war protesters, and the United Nations for a period of 8 months before it eventually collapsed under US pressure. Until that moment, the UN itself was on the side of the protests. So you had, when I was writing a book about this protest, and I talked about the role of movements, people's movements, as the most important component, but the role of governments and the UN as part of that challenge to empire. And that was also very different than what we had seen in other protests about other issues. So there were a lot of things that made it different and made it possible for us to somehow see this notion that there were 800 cities around the world in whatever it was, 94 countries or more than that. I'm not even sure.
72, actually.
There we go. And that morning, the morning of February 15th, before the protest began in New York, a very small group of us met with Kofi Annan on behalf of these protesters from all over the world, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And here you had Desmond Tutu and Kofi Annan facing each other across the table. And Bishop Tutu began, and he started to say directly to Kofi, he said, "We are here on behalf of all the people marching in all these cities around the world. And we're here to tell you that those people marching in all those cities, we claim the United Nations as our own. We claim it in the name of the global mobilization for peace." It was an extraordinary moment. It was an extraordinary moment that went directly to this point of the role of the United Nations for the first time, standing up to US pressure, until it didn't anymore, and then paid a huge price, of course. But for those months, it did. And that made it stronger as well.
Yeah.
Just as a side panel here, which we may come back to maybe another time, although the internet was there, interestingly, it was the internet and not social media, because now everyone is used to thinking the only way to organize anything in a meaningful way is social media. And actually, this was pre-social media. It was kind of in that space between the old school, you know, just handing out leaflets and having face-to-face meetings, and social and the internet. And basically, email is what you're. So it's something we may want to come back to in terms of movement building and so on.
Yeah, I wanted actually to go back to you've all raised very important questions, and there are questions that the film itself raises as well about, you know, what is success, what is failure for a movement. But I think we pretty much all are activist organizers on this panel. We know how difficult it is to organize a demonstration with many people. So I'd like, in a way, I know Phyllis, Anas, Colleen, you were directly involved in organizing these incredible marches around the world. How did you do it? Because it's a momentous event, and I think that's what the film is so. What you were saying, Anas, you know, when I've watched the film 3 times, I think in the last 2 weeks, because, you know, preparing the panel and stuff. And even if you know the end, I do totally agree that every time you feel so empowered that you sort of might think, hey, maybe the end's going to be different this time, you know, because, and you see, I mean, what's comes out very strongly in the film is the emotions. I guess, you know, when you spoke to Phyllis, this was years after the demonstration, John Rees from the Stop the War Coalition, people on the verge of tears when they remember these events, because it was so momentous. And we've all been in demonstrations where it's so big that you feel overwhelmed. So I'd like to know, I mean, maybe start with Colleen, and then Phyllis, you can jump in and ask as well. How did it happen? And I know it's a very complex answer, but, you know.
It's always very complicated.
Yeah.
How did it happen? I think back to other organizers that showed September 11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows how to do this. So after the initial shock of that 9/11, 2001, after that had worn off, not only did family members find each other and form a community, but then other communities of family members started to reach out to us. So the Parent Circle, who are a group of bereaved Israeli and Palestinian parents who work together for peace. The Habakusha from Hiroshima and Nagasaki came to visit in New York, and Not in Our Name in New York City. And these groups kind of helped shepherd us and helped shepherd our energies into a larger, we had a certain role within the movement, but there were lots of people with many different roles that just made the movement even stronger. It's really hopeful having this film festival 20 years later. It was the 20th anniversary, of course, this past month, but also, in the film we see Colin Powell before the United Nations and his presentation and understanding the role of power, and power that's directly going against the will of the people. And with Colin Powell's death 2 weeks ago, it again brings back, what we all can do, what we have done, but what we can do and we need to keep doing to organize with each other to push back against the powers that be that make it so difficult for everyday people's lives. And so it's really helpful to be joining together again with people that are both on this panel, but also people watching the film, because it's a movement of hope, and it's a movement that certainly has a long arc. We are human beings, and I'll stop there.
Yeah. It's amazing to hear from you, Colleen, about the how 9/11 families came together. It was one of the most inspiring parts of our movement. There were other parts like that. The military families speak out, which were mainly parents, a few siblings, but mainly parents of mostly very young soldiers who had just been deployed in Iraq and some in Afghanistan. And they played an extraordinary role in bringing home that this was a volunteer army that was being deployed around the world for a war that nobody wanted in the US. It was massively unpopular, unlike the war in Afghanistan, where we had to work very hard, and it took years. Now we see that 76% of people in the United States were against the war in Afghanistan, wanted it to end, believed it had never been worth it. But at the time of the US going to war, 88% of people supported it. So it was very difficult to build a movement against that war. But George Bush had become so quickly, so incredibly unpopular, that a large part of the movement was strengthened by an anti-Bush component. The war was seen as illegal. It was seen as bullying the rest of the world. And I think that the recent efforts of Bush to be rehabilitated, if you will, he spends his time now drawing lovely pictures of puppies. Bush remains a war criminal. And the fact that Donald Trump did so much additional damage, more damage, domestically in particular and internationally as well, does not change that. So it's a tricky business, if you will, how these movements are built. But I think what's the important thing is there wasn't any secret about it. We were dealing with, by the time the Iraq war was coming, and everybody knew that it was coming, and everyone knew that there were questions at least about the validity of these claims, and a lot of people were already convinced it was a lie, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, there was no uranium yellow cake from Niger, that these claims were simply made up whole cloth, that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. These were straight up lies. And more people were accepting that they were lies. So there was a rising rage in the US. So when the call came for the demonstration of February 15th, it was after almost a year of additional demonstrations. The first demonstration of the global war on terror was held on the day the war in Afghanistan started, October 7th. And it was because we knew that war was going to be the result. And when that happens, the ability to mobilize happens in a whole easier way. It still meant, as you heard Leslie Kagan talk about, she was chairing the United for Peace and Justice Coalition, several million pieces of literature, flyers, announcements, billboards were distributed in that 7-week period of building the demonstration because people wanted something. They wanted to do something that might have a chance of stopping this war. So it made it a lot easier than it would have been. It was hard.
I mean,
but easier than-
I mean, taking on what Phyllis has just said, I believe that there were three main elements that made what seemed to be an almost impossible mission actually come true, and even more so. And I think that one of those is definitely the arrogance of the American administration at the time, and the fact that the British people also got tired of the narrative that was pursued by Tony Blair, a Labour government that was supposed to stand for something, all of a sudden shifting violently towards the right and disappointing so many of its constituents and those who had celebrated its coming to power in 1997. But also beyond that, I think that the fact that so many elements actually came together, and desperate elements, by the way, meaning the elements that belong to different ideological, political, social groups coming together, I think that gave people the sort of oomph, the sort of impetus in order to join this, to believe in this. And that's something that politicians today seem to not recognize. The fact that people, whilst probably supporting this party or that, but they would rather see politicians coming together and collaborating. And what happened back then, in the case of the UK, many European countries, and of course, the same Colleen and Phyllis will speak about the US, the fact that, you know, the Muslim community represented by the Muslim Association in Britain, along with Stop the War Coalition, along with CND, the Coalition Against Nuclear Disarmament, all coming together, that meant not only that people saw that this was a cause that was so righteous, that these people who came from different ideological backgrounds came together, laying aside all their differences in order to fight for this cause, and therefore, you know, giving people the message that they ought to fight for it as well. So that was, I think, a very, very important battle, but also the fact that each of us had our own constituencies and our own groups who would listen to us and our own audiences who others wouldn't be able to reach. And therefore, spreading the message about the 15th of February around the world became so much easier and accessible. And the last thing I'd like to mention, and this is something also for all of us to keep in mind whenever we try to mobilize or to campaign, and there are so many issues that we continue to campaign and mobilize for, and that is the simplicity of the message. The message must be simple. It was stop the war on Iraq. No war. It was that simple. And that brought to the streets of London and Washington and Los Angeles and Sydney and people who wouldn't normally march, who wouldn't normally, you know, leave their Saturdays in order to go out and wave a flag or a banner for a political cause. But they did because the message was so simple. And it's something that resonated with virtually everyone. And that's why you'll find that, for instance, in the trailer as well as in the film, Damon Albarn saying that I thought I was in the wrong place. I didn't know. Or was it Mark Rylance? Mark Rylance, who said, I wasn't sure, because there were families, there were kids, there were elderly, there were grannies, there were granddads, there were, you know, all sorts of people from all walks of life, all walks of society. And I think that those three elements were what made our mission not easy, but easier. And the response was amplified. The impact was amplified. The efforts that were done in holding meetings and traveling up and down countries, not only in our case the UK, but also in Belgium, Holland, Frank will know, in France, in Spain, in Scandinavia. It was something that people accepted, embraced, and then owned. And therefore, the fact is that when you look at the scenes on the streets of all these cities, those millions around the world, you can't really say that, you know, you forget who the organizers were. You forget MAB or Stop the War or CN. You forget, because they become totally irrelevant. What really matters is that the people of the world owned this. It was theirs.
But can I just add one point to that? I think you're right, Anas, but I think there is one other component, which is that other than the UK and to some degree the US, throughout most of the world, including much of Europe, the key forces that started organizing were not just a bunch of different diverse people who ultimately came out. It was the global justice movement, the anti-corporate globalization movement that had been at its height in 1999 and 2000 and took an enormous hit, if you will, as a result of the 9/11 attacks. It stopped that movement in its tracks. But it was that movement, if you look, for example, in Florence in November, when it was the European Social Forum that was meeting, where Raffaella gets up and announces this movement against war. Those organizations, and particularly in the global South, in Asia, in the Philippines, across Latin America, those organizations had not been dealing with issues of war and peace until the Bush administration and this post-9/11 response. And it transformed those movements into anti-war movements as well. And they were very well organized. So it really did strengthen the backbone of the organizing.
Thanks, Phyllis. Yeah, I mean, we'll go back to this, how to create a global movement and how to organize with different groups that have sometimes different, slightly different political views, because that's the key, and that's, I guess, the hardest part, of our work. I wanted to come to you, Dr. Sami. When I introduced people, you had disappeared from our screen, so I will quickly introduce you. So Dr. Sami Al-Arian is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs and in Istanbul. He was named actually in 2001. You were named by Newsweek the premier civil rights activist in the US for your efforts to repeal the use of secret evidence in immigration courts. And in a way, I'll come back to this in a bit, because this was an amazing. You had to do an amazing organizing work to actually do this, and I'd like to focus on this. And your story actually was featured in the film festival, USA versus Al-Arian. This was a film released in 2016. So Sami, you were a speaker at two of the biggest rallies in Washington in 2002 around actually Palestine and Iraq at the time. Tony Benn, the late Tony Benn, at one point in Amir's film, says that we are starting something big. Did you feel at the time, so around 2002, that potentially something big was starting?
Well, thank you, Frank, for your kind words. Today was my first time seeing this film, actually, and brought so many memories, because 2002 was indeed the year where many demonstrations took place. I remember back in April 2002 when Bush gave Sharon the green light to go and attack Jenin. And it was probably one of the biggest demonstrations I've seen in the United States, over 500,000, I believe, came to Washington. And then we had another one, as Phyllis noted, in New York, in Washington, in October. And then I was invited to come to February 15th, but then we had one in Tampa right in front of CENTCOM, which was leading the military effort. And I was asked to be there. So that's why I decided to attend that one in Tampa. The next day was in Sarasota. So it was demonstrations all over the world. These 789 cities and 72 countries, where when you talk about cities, this was way across the United States, every big and small towns. So yes, indeed, that was a momentous time. And for me also, 2002 was a personal thing, because I was dismissed from my university. I was fighting that, and also I was pursued by the U.S. government. This demonstration on February the 15th was on Saturday. On Friday, somebody called me and said, "You're going to be arrested next week." I got this from a leak from the Justice Department. So I was expecting. I didn't know whether I will make it or not for the next day. And indeed, my arrest came 5 days later on February the 20th. And when Iraq war took place, I was on hunger strike. I was in solitary confinement. So I only heard about it from the radio. But going back, yes, of course, you felt it in the air. When these demonstrations were taking place, you felt, people coming from all walks of life coming together for these issues. To me, there are three kinds of injustices. There is first the personal injustice, the personal feeling of being dealt unjustly or personally wrong. But there is also the second kind of injustice, which would be communal. You fight for a cause, for a struggle. You try to fight for a cause that is larger than you. You're part of that struggle. But there is a third kind, and you could see it quite vividly in this film, as well as when we were demonstrating in the United States, where you feel injustice and repression by your own country. And you're willing to stand up to the government, willing to stand up to those powers that are trying to pacify not only the world, but also your own society. And that's what was taking place. Now we talk about the national security state, the surveillance state, but those hundreds of thousands, millions of people that came out, they were standing up and demonstrating against their own government, their own country, in the time where fear was gripping people from coast to coast. And I think, that courage, that bravery, I think should be noted. I certainly, felt that, and we felt really close, brothers and sisters coming all together, different faiths, different creeds, different colors, different cities, different geographies, all coming together to champion this cause, which is basically standing up to the military-industrial complex, to the national security state, to these arrogant, people. They're called neocons, but they were really set on trying to basically occupy the whole world. Change regimes as they wish, and go from one country to another and try to impose their will on hundreds of millions of people. Basically, yes, we failed in a sense, as was noted, but I think it created other movements. And I remember I was in a house arrest when Occupy movement came about, and we happened to study these movements. And it came right after the Arab Spring was taking place across the Middle East. And I think all these movements, which people are trying to get rid of, those powers, those imperialists, crony capitalism, whatever you name it, these autocratic regimes, anti-democratic forces. And I think maybe we can have this part of the discussion sometime today, is that we need to see how we can resist. Demonstrations is great, but it's not enough. We saw this, and the demoralization effect, because Bush was intent and Blair was intent on going and obviously starting a war. With that, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people got killed, and we have to know that resistance made a difference. Just imagine if there was no Iraqi resistance, they would have claimed victory. Everybody else would be demoralized. Everyone else would say, "Okay, we were wrong. All right, it doesn't matter whether there was WMD or not. They got what they wanted." But because of that resistance, which came from people, they are considered war criminals. They are failures, and they are not able to claim any kind of vindication or victory. And I think that's a great tribute, both to the Afghani resistance and to the Iraqi.
That's actually. Yeah, go, Colleen. Sorry.
No, if I may add one thing to Sammy's notions of the injustice, this three injustices: the personal injustice, communal injustice, and, as you said, Sammy, the idea that your government is now committing injustice. I would add to that kind of an altruism, that February 15th was largely also about people's notion that an injustice was going to be done to people that I don't know. They're not necessarily part of my community. I don't live near them, but an injustice was going to be happening, and in some way in my name. And so that altruism that was evident around the world, because we all knew that the Iraqi people would be harmed and hurt and killed unjustly. So thank you for bringing up this notion of injustice and the future, what would happen.
Yeah, also interesting, I find, is what Sami ended with, and it's absolutely true. In any other circumstance, if we were reading a history book, Tony Blair and George Bush should be regarded as military leaders who led their countries into victory in a war. However, we find both Blair and Bush, before any interview, before any meeting, having the other party sign a document saying you will never bring up Iraq. Never bring up Iraq. Don't ever mention Iraq, despite the fact that they achieved what could be said to be a military victory. So that in itself is telling. But also, and I believe Phyllis alluded to this, and that is how those movements, that movement, that global movement against the tyranny of the superpowers of the time, actually led to those states, those regimes, if you wish, in Washington as well as in London and elsewhere, thinking not only twice but 100 times before launching another attack against any other nation. I think the momentum, the intensity, the impact of that global movement resonated so far and wide that it impacted maybe not Iraq as we had all wanted, but definitely further considerations of a military application in later years.
Can I just also, go ahead, actually, Phyllis. I know you were going to make a point directly as a result, but
no, just quickly. I think that one of those examples was the threat of Bush going to war against Iran in 2007. It was very real. And we know that there were discussions about the danger of dividing the country and massive protests, again, the equivalent to what they had seen in the run-up to war in Iraq. I don't believe that that was the sole reason they made a judgment not to. I think they made the judgment for a bunch of different reasons, but that was certainly one of the considerations. And so when we look at the question of what is the consequence of global actions and US actions and British actions relative to their own governments and relative to governments around the world, we have to keep in mind those other potential things that don't happen as a result of that. So it goes to this notion of how protests have within them the seeds of other victories. What we saw in the film, the first effort by the Obama administration to threaten to go to war against Syria. And we did manage to stop that, following the model of the popular movement and then ultimately the parliament in the UK. We were able to do the same thing. Now, we also know that 1 year later, Obama did send the bombers back into Syria and led to a dramatic worsening of the situation for many people in Syria. But there was a moment when there was a year that didn't happen. And that year was very much tied to the legacy of February 15th, 2003, when we knew that it was possible to build a movement that could raise these issues and could mobilize large numbers of people. Before we used the term intersectionality, we were mobilizing large numbers of people who didn't necessarily think in those terms all the time. In the anti-war period around Iraq, the United for Peace and Justice Coalition that we had created, at its height, it had over 1,500 member organizations, ranging from certainly peace groups, but there were trade unions and women's organizations and youth groups and people of color organizations, all kinds of organizations joined because the war in Iraq at that moment was seen as the linchpin of a terrible strategy that the Bush administration was trying to impose on the world. And it was for that reason that everybody felt they had to be part of it.
I'll just tell you a little funny thing that happened on Friday night. I happened to be with some friends, and they had a friend there who was an American former reporter. And we started talking about, she'd been in the Middle East, but then originally in New York. And she said she used to work for ABC. When she asked me about what I did, and I told her about this film, and she said, "Oh, I was on that protest." And she said, "You know what? I was on the protest. I worked for ABC News, and that night ABC News had 10 seconds of coverage about the protest. Now, what's interesting about that is that I would wager there are probably the majority of people in any city you think about, whether it's New York or London, anywhere, probably only remember the protest in their own city. And I mean, I still meet people who will go, "Oh yeah, I was on that protest," and when the conversation about the film develops, they're amazed to find out that it was global. It was in 72 countries. It was in 789 cities, and so on. I mean, so in a sense, there's a whole story here about narrative and media, and it touches on what Anas was saying about why we need to protest. I mean, the thing about that protest, I suppose, is that it showed to history that the likes of Blair and Bush cannot say we protested so we went to war with the support of the public. That they cannot say that. And in a way, that's why I was determined to make the film, because I wanted to make a historical record, not just of an extraordinary story, but so that there will be a record of it, so that you can look at it and go, "Oh, I see. There is the evidence." Because I mean, who was it that said? I'm going to get this paraphrase wrong, but that history is the battle of remembering against forgetting, and there is this constant attempt to rewrite the narrative. It was when the 20th anniversary of Afghanistan, happened, and I discovered this term, anniversary journalism. When there was a whole lot of anniversary journalism going on, and trying even in that to rewrite it. And for those of you who are not in the UK, but Anas will be aware, just in the last few weeks, there's been a TV series on the BBC about Blair and Brown, in which they've been given an opportunity yet again to tell the narrative that they told. So it's an ongoing narrative, battle as well.
But just on that particular point, Amir, it's absolutely comical. It's really, really absurd how till now, whenever I'm on a panel having a debate with politicians or with whoever, unfailingly, former MPs, current MPs, councillors, lawmakers of all sorts, will say, "Oh, the 15th of February. Oh yes, I was there." And I remember actually bursting out in laughter when someone said, "Oh, by the way, I was there. My mother was there. My sister was there. We were all there. Although I voted with Blair and I voted for the war." I couldn't help myself. I burst out laughing. It's something that everyone, it's as though, that moment when people say, "Oh, I was on that march in that particular city," or "I was on this march in this particular city." Anyone who wasn't on the march, and this is something that someone told me, they said, for weeks after, we would ask our colleagues at work or at university, "Were you on the march?" And if anyone dared say, "No, I wasn't," they would say, "Why on earth weren't you?" So everyone now claims to be part of that, which is absolutely fine, because it goes to prove that once you have a message that is right, that is of truth, that is of justice, against power, and the proclamation that whoever bears the gun must be the bearer of truth, people will join and people will want to be part of that. We just need to be a little bit more patient and a little bit louder, I believe.
Sorry, I wanted us, if possible, to reflect on what you just said in the last few minutes, because Amir, you mentioned this BBC doc on Blair and Brown, enabling them to sort of reframe the narrative the way they want it to be, and in the documentary and tonight we've spoken about the "not in our name" sort of slogan. And I think this is really crucial because, we have to make this clear, right? Governments go to war and people die, right? If you read the news, there's always this brewing war coming up, right? Now, the US and China, maybe it's going to be a war. I mean, the US and Russia at one point. And the craziness is, it's about whatever 10 head of states like bickering about whatever deals and influence on the world they have, that potentially will lead to a war that will kill. I mean, nowadays, I don't know if there's a war, how many millions are going to die. So the not in our name, I think, is a crucial aspect of the demonstrations and the organizing. And that's something, as an organizer myself, I encounter quite often people that say, like, look, it's amazing what you're doing, you and your friends going on demonstrations and stuff, but, it doesn't change anything, So the thing about failure is crucial, because for me, when you have 2 million plus people on the streets, it's never a failure. And what I tell my friends when they tell me that is that just imagine if we weren't here, if we weren't on the streets. And someone said this before, just imagine if they could have gone to war with no demonstration or anything, So for me, like protest, in a way, we tend to be reactive or reactionary, but at least we play this buffer aspect of, like, at least, the worst has not come yet, and we can't do maybe better, right now, but at least we're on the streets, and thanks to this, they didn't go to war against Iran in 2007 and the rest. So it's important, I think, if we want to convince more people that, and even more now, I mean, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about, I mean, it's slightly off topic, but I don't think it is, COP26 and global warming, which might destroy human civilization and all the other species on Earth. It's crucial to explain to people that, no, we haven't failed, as Phyllis was saying. So sorry, I went on, but someone wanted to speak, I think maybe Sami.
Yeah, I just wanted to note something about protests, because there are two kinds of protests. And this comment is probably more relevant to the Muslim community around the world. When we look at Syria, for example, the people who are against the regime, the opposition, were pretty upset. They wanted the United States to go and attack. And that created a lot of tension with other people, because unfortunately, many people under autocratic dictatorships, violent regimes, they just try to bring any kind of help without realizing that there is a very strong popular anti-war movement around the world that they don't identify with, because this is a fight against empires, imperialism, exploitation, unrestrained crony capitalism, and so on and so forth. They don't see this. All what they see is their own suffering, and they want a quick, violent reaction to that, and that creates tension. So you have two kinds of protests. The protests that go on trying to encourage government policy, and we saw this in certain arenas. And there are these brave demonstrations that go, with principles, with values, that we're against war as a principle, and also we are against government policy when it comes to the point where hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions, would suffer. I remember the first demonstration I was in was back in 1980. It was Iran and the United States, right after the revolution. Actually, it was in 79, not 80. It was in the fall of 79. And there you have a couple of thousand people, and a lot of Americans were in it, and they were called traitors because of the hostage crisis and so on and so forth. And then you had other kind of demonstrations where you're basically trying to advance government policy. And it's very important that we distinguish between the two, that when people are principled and they are against war as means of ending disputes, people have to respect that, not to start engaging. And that's part of the fights that go on today when it comes to some of these issues. And I think we need to realize this, and that we need to have a global movement against injustice. And war is not the means by which we're going to end injustice. It has to be a much larger discussion, global discussion, and we certainly can agree on the ends, and we may differ on the means, but that should not detract us from being one united global, because at the end, as the film demonstrates, we have people power. We really don't have much of that, violent and power and armies and being able to end disputes through these kind of means. All what we have is, and I hope we can engage this discussion, what can we do in order to end injustice around the world?
If I could just jump in on this very important question Sami just raised about, and it's the Syria example in many ways was one of the most painful and the most difficult, and in some ways remains so. For me, it's understandable that people living in desperate circumstances, facing desperate levels of repression, will call out for any support they think they can get. I understand that. I don't think that means necessarily or ever that for those of us in, for example, in the United States, where the demand from some people in Syria, as was true in Libya as well, some people called for US intervention. Others immediately said, no, we don't need US intervention. But some did call for it. And it doesn't mean that we attack those people for being agents of imperialism or something like that. It means understanding that when people are desperate, they will call for any kind of help they can get. And it means that those of us, for example, who have the privilege of living outside of that war zone, and in this case, in the United States, where that government was the one looking for a way to justify intervention, that we have to be the ones to say, no, we can't support that, even when some people are saying we want it. And that became a hugely paralyzing factor, that contradiction in the Syria movement, and the impact of it in the period around 2014, 15, 16, was that the bitterness of that struggle in the United States, waged by a very small group of people on both sides, very, very tiny group of people in social media, more than anywhere else, made it so toxic that a large number of people did not want to engage in the struggle to help figure out how to end a brutal war that was underway. Because this small group of people on both sides wanted to say, we want to win that war, not we want to end the war. And this point that Sami is making, I think, is so important, that the goal has to be to look at justice. And that usually means ending a war. The people fighting militarily in these days, in my experience, are mostly not forces that we want to support, we in the broad progressive movement globally. This is not the era of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the movement against fascism in Spain, Vietnam, Angola, Mozambique, Central America, where people not only wanted an end to military intervention by the US in those cases, but they also wanted to support the people on, quote, the other side. So in the anti-war movement around Vietnam, there was a core of people in the middle, in the center of that movement. It wasn't everybody, it wasn't a majority, but it was a significant and influential core who supported the Vietnamese, who had the right to challenge these invaders, whether it was France or England. In South Africa, there were people from all over the world, small numbers of people. There's a new book just coming out about this, who went as individuals to join the secret components of the African National Congress and work with them to bring in leaflets into South Africa, all of those things, who were part of that struggle, because we not only wanted the US to stop supporting the government in South Africa, the apartheid regime, but we wanted the other side to win, and this is a very different situation, I think, when we look at the difference between the civil society movements, both around the world and in the countries where these wars are being waged, whether in Syria, in Iraq, elsewhere. There's a big difference between those movements and the military components of the resistance, where a lot of people around the world in the broad progressive movement do not want to support those movements in terms of what they stand for, but they do recognize the importance of the civil society movements that are the crucial part of the resistance. So I think it's been a very hard time for that. and we're learning slowly how to deal with it.
I just want to make a little point about, well, firstly, I agree with Sammy and Phyllis about that point regarding protest. But the recently in the UK, the Home Secretary here has been trying to introduce a new policing bill, which also covers protest. And this new policing bill is effectively going to limit and effectively give the powers to the police and to the government to effectively rule out protest. And this will make you laugh if it's laughable, that they say you can protest as long as it doesn't, quote, annoy people. So I mean, I don't know what's happening in America, but certainly the direction that we're going here in the UK is that even the right to protest is going to be limited and curtailed and potentially maybe even, removed. So when we talk about, protest and activism and movement building and so on, I mean, we may look wistfully back in 2003 as a time and the whole of the decade afterwards as a time when you could protest, because that may not be possible much longer. Certainly if the government in the UK has its way, we're going in that direction where if someone, maybe the Home Secretary, if someone says, I think these anti-war protests are going to annoy me, then that is now the definition by which a protest could be banned, which then raises the question, okay, so activists for, decades and centuries have used street protest as a means of organizing and movement building and so on. What other tools can there be in the toolbox that we have to think about as levers that people can pull outside of street protest? And I think that is a very, very interesting discussion, but it just means that, street protest, at least, as I say here, may finish, may be ruled out.
If I can come in, I mean, I think that the point that Amir made is extremely important and quite relevant to the future of this global movement. And this law that is being passed here in Britain and I believe will be copy-pasted across many European countries, probably adopted also by America and Canada. And that, if anything, it goes to show the power of protests. I mean, all those of our friends and families and neighbors and the such who argue, it doesn't really work. Well, we only have to point to the incessant attempts by governments, including the British government, to actually limit and restrict protests. If they didn't really work, they wouldn't bother, but they did, and they do. So I think that in itself is important. But in response to the point that Amir makes and the question he raises, we have to sometimes remind ourselves that we are almost 19 years on from that momentous day, from the 15th of February 2003. That's an entire generation. I attended someone's wedding only a few weeks ago, only to be told that the bride, the groom was a 5-year-old on that day, marching with his parents, and he made the embarrassing statement that, I remember Dr. Anas Al-Tikriti, he was on stage and I was only 5 years old looking up. And I was looking at him thinking, my God, it's been 19 years. It's been 19 years. And throughout these 19 years, we've seen an explosion of new means and methods and platforms and ways to communicate and ways to mobilize and ways to impact, and how narratives have changed and evolved, and how. So we do need to find new ways in order to circumvent the attempts to restrict the expressions that were so influential in 2002, 2003, and still are, I believe. But the fact is that many people And this I found quite interesting only a few weeks ago, when we're having these Insulate Britain and the protests against government policy regarding climate change and the such. School kids took to the streets. They left their classes and they took to the streets. It's the go-to way of expressing anger and frustration. So whilst we need to find alternative means, but this way will remain quite important. And just one final thing that, on this particular point, We Are Many is about the global demonstrations, the millions upon millions from all the way from Fiji and the Solomon Islands, all the way to Chile, that marched throughout those 24 hours on the 15th of February, 2003. And it was in order to prevent the war on Iraq. The biggest validation of that particular day is, look at Iraq today. Look at the state of Iraq today. Look at how they have brought the entire country and its nation to their knees. Look at how this war resulted in absolute abject misery and suffering and pain for everyone in Iraq. Look at how they tried to divide, and they continue to try to divide people across ethnic and sectarian and ideological lines. But the fact of the matter is, everyone, regardless of whether they're afraid of the other, but everyone is suffering exactly the same. When electricity goes, it goes for everyone. Sunni, Shia, Muslim, Christian, everyone. When there's no clean drinking water, it's for everyone. When there's lack of security, it's for everyone. So that, I believe, is the absolute verdict on the adventure, the endeavor that Bush and Blair fought, and the absolute validation and vindication of the global movement to stop that war. That is something that we need to talk about. We need to talk about more and more and more.
Thanks, Anas. I think we've got about 20 minutes left, and I wanted to really touch on this point. What did Phyllis? You mentioned we keep learning from what we do, and so what have we learned, or what have you learned from these protests that have shown in the film, and also what are the means of resistance there is, because if they make protest unlawful, what do we do? Do we obey the law, or do we then go to civil disobedience mode? And Phyllis, you've mentioned South Africa, and I think are you talking about the book called London Recruits, or that?
Well, no, there's another one coming up.
Okay.
There's a global one that's about to be published.
Okay, and South Africa is very interesting because there were many elements to this struggle. You had the advocates of the boycott, you had the non-violent protest, you also had the armed resistance and the more violent protest. And I think all these elements, and obviously you had on top of that international solidarity, which came in very different means, whether it was from other sort of 1,000 African states or from UK, US, and the rest. But all these elements made the fall of apartheid possible. And there is now, in various movements, there is this debate with violence, non-violence. I'm actually reading a very good book at the moment called How to Blow Up a Pipeline by an activist called Andreas Malm, about the global, anti-global warming movement, which is crucial when the stakes are, when the world is so radically wrong, and what do we do as activists? And I'd like, maybe the next few minutes of the discussion to focus on this. So I don't know who wants to start, but yeah.
Well, I'll jump in since you were referencing what I was saying about South Africa. The anti-apartheid movement globally, in the 1980s in particular, when it was at its height, had a great, a great tool that magnified its work and made its work far more strategic. And that was that while there were several organizations in South Africa, there was a recognition that the ANC, the African National Congress, was the leading organization. And it had a very clear 4-part strategy, one part of which was the international solidarity movement. The smallest part was their armed struggle, and they understood that to mean only symbolic armed struggle. They were not engaging in a civil war. They were not engaging in guerrilla warfare. They had a military wing, but its writ was quite narrow and quite small. The role of the mass mobilization in South Africa was by far the most important component. Second was the underground organization, which was not the military part, but just the protection of how to organize the mass movement. Third was the global solidarity movement, and fourth was the very small armed struggle. In the world today, we don't have that. It's a different era. I would argue that there is not a struggle in the world today where I believe the military struggle, the armed struggle, is a useful or strategic or good thing to do. I don't see it. We're in a different era than we were, and I don't see a single place where I think the use of armed force, including against pipelines, is a good idea. That doesn't mean that, what I think isn't really very relevant necessarily. People can think what they want. But when I look at what we need to do in our movements, when we talk about alternative strategies and alternative tactics, to me, that does not include armed struggle. It just doesn't. And I think that we need to be looking beyond street protests, not only because they may become illegal in some countries. It sounds like the UK is even ahead of the US right now on the idea of actually criminalizing street protest as a whole. But street protest alone has never changed history. Street protest changes political calculations of those in power, and they have to make their calculations based on what that street protest demonstrates. The term demonstration, I think we often forget what it actually means. I think that we're talking about a demonstration of something. In the case of February 15th, we were demonstrating that it was this massive majorities of people all around the world that were opposed to this potential war, this looming war against Iraq. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are not, that we're not looking at any other kind of protest, but we do have to be careful. People often want to go into the streets when what they are demonstrating is weakness. And I think that some of us who may say, I don't think we should have a street protest right now, sometimes get accused of being too conservative or something like that, when the reality is we're trying to make a judgment on what will we be demonstrating. Will we be demonstrating strength, or will we be demonstrating weakness? So I think we do need alternatives, and that includes efforts within political parties and Congress and running for office. It means doing work at the local level to build up new generations of activists. It means all kinds of things. But I don't think we will ever be in a position to say we are prepared to simply stop doing street protests because the government says that as a category, street protesting is illegal. I think absolutely some kind of civil disobedience will be required. I also think it's unlikely that it will be as straightforward as that. The language will be much more complicated, much more nuanced, and it will be tested in the courts and tested elsewhere what it actually means in practice. And we'll have to be there testing it every step of the way and pushing and pushing and pushing and risking arrest and all of that to stop that kind of law from being imposed.
If someone wants to jump in, feel free.
Yeah. Well,
yes, I mean, yeah.
I would like to reference, our struggle back in the late 90s. Actually, it started in 95 when the FBI was trying to get the previous version of the Patriot Act. I remember back in 95 they had a version that we looked at, and it was pretty stunning at the time. Of course, Patriot Act was 10 times more even, but still. And our response was not protest, really. It's more organizing. I think what we need to do is to strategize, organize, and mobilize. And protest is just part of that mobilization set of tools, as Phyllis referenced. If you have a vision, what you need for any successful project of resistance, you need three things. We need a vision, we need will, and then we need action. If you have these three things, then you can probably make things successful. And to do that, we need to start thinking about how we can organize communities. I remember when I took a training course back 25 years ago in community organizing, one of the questions that they would ask people was, what makes you angry? Because to answer that question will bring the values that you uphold, particularly if it's related to justice. I remember when we had secret evidence, the moment I was looking, because it was, the targets were basically immigrants, and very few Americans would care about immigrants. So you had to go and ally with other, start building coalitions and alliances with others. And Phyllis was there. I remember when we started that movement, National Coalition to Protect Political Freedom. And locally, I was looking for other organizations. There was this particular one that cared about justice issues at the local level. It's called Hillsborough Organization for Progress and Equality, HOPE. And we started bringing together communities and voting on secret evidence to be adopted. I remember I was trying to bring the ACLU for that fight. And when I failed to bring them on a consistent basis, I just went there and became a board member. I was elected. I nominated myself and I got elected. And then that point was on the agenda every single meeting. And, when I went to the NAACP, they said, why don't you become a member? Why are you just talking to me? So I became a member. And the first conference, I had a resolution passed against secret evidence. And this is how we build a movement. You need to get involved, find out who is on the front lines and get them involved. And this process takes 5 stages, again, from our experience. First, you do it at the community level. You bring your community into these issues. You mobilize them. You start, having these discussions with them and get them motivated to become part of that. Then you go to the larger public, and that's where you start building these coalitions, through education, through engagement, and through different kind of actions. Third, you get the media, because the media has a much larger voice. And today with social media, you're probably going to get even larger space where you can act. And fourth this is where you have to get to public officials. We cannot ignore that at the end, it's politicians that make these decisions. Whether you go to war or not to go to war, these are done by public officials. We cannot ignore that. And you have to put the pressure on them to the point where they have to make a decision, in the right decision, the decisions that you favor, the decision that you want them to make. The last one would be the legal community and the courts. These are the last ones to move, the slowest version, with very few exceptions. I mean, Brown versus the Board of Education is one of the very few exceptions, but it's in that level. So we cannot, basically say, okay, we protest. One of the things that was shown in that movie, how people were demoralized once the war started. They just went home. Because there wasn't this infrastructure, there wasn't this organization, there wasn't this realization that this struggle is going to go on and on and on and on until you go through these 5 phases. And at the end, it's politicians. When the parliament at the time voted for war in Britain, which basically, in Congress, even more lopsided. I mean, then people, okay, it's done. No, it's not done, because people were in the streets. That meant that they have to go and not go home until they change. When the Occupy movement was taking place, I was very encouraged. And at the same time, I thought this is not going to come to a good conclusion, because it wasn't organized enough to make political change. And that's what you need to that's what we need to move that conversation a little bit. 100 million people, over 100 million people did not vote. in the last election, in that last elections, because they were dissatisfied by both candidates, or maybe because they didn't care. How do we get them involved? How can we get someone who believes in these issues and who can actually make change, not that just at the executive level, but also at the legislative and others? And the last point I want to make has to do with what is it that we are trying to achieve. And I think we need to embrace the same way. Okay, so we're anti-war, but we need to embrace a cause that can actually mobilize millions again in the streets in the same way that happened in February 2003. And I can't think of better cause than the Palestinian cause. And I think here, if you defeat this apartheid state, you're going to defeat everything else in that unjust world, whether it's imperialism, whether it's empire, what's exploitation of people, whether it's unrestrained crony capitalism. This corporations are trying to, the multinational corporations, the supremacist ideologies, everything is in that fight. And we can actually make a change. I mean, what you see today is the last vestige of settler colonialism. If you want to make what happened in America hundreds of years ago against Native Americans, this is your fight, because we're not going to let the Palestinians be the next Native Americans, where a few 100,000 will just be there so that they can make as if that this has come, peacefully. It didn't. We need this global movement for justice in Palestine, where we can bring again 780 or 800 or 900 or 1,000 cities in the streets demanding the end of apartheid, the last country that has actual apartheid that is being tolerated by almost every country in the world. We need to put the government's feet to the fire and tell them that this is unacceptable. How we mobilize this again back, you have to do it one by one, organization by organization, person by person, congressman by congressman, member of parliament by member of parliament. That's the real struggle. And we don't need violence for that. Actually, it is to your advantage, because their response is always using violence. In our case, our advantage is people power. And that's what we need to do. We need global movement to start organizing again and creating these images again that you see with this film, and you feel, for 3/4 of a film, you feel energized that this is the wave, and then boom, you have this war and everybody is demoralized. We can reignite this struggle again if we embrace this as being the global movement that's going to change what's happening in Palestine. And believe me, when that happens, all other arrogant politicians and governments will take notice, because this is big. Because the people who are supporting the Israeli state today are the most powerful in the world. If you defeat that project, then you would defeat these people as well.
Thank you.
If I may,
and that's actually we've got 5 minutes left. Okay. So what I wanted to do is maybe give you each a couple of minutes to wrap up, if you have something to say, of course. So you can start, I guess, Anas.
Thank you, Frank. Listen, this is the final session of what has been, I think, a fantastic initiative, and that is the film festival for the War on Terror, or the War on Terror Film Festival. I think it's been absolutely fantastic, and it would be a shame to merely just move on as though nothing has happened without reaping the fruits of all of this. I'm in touch with movements far and wide. I'm pretty sure every single one of you is as well. And the question that was posed by Frank is a question that everyone asks. And to be perfectly honest, I think that we have far greater and more impactful means in our capacities than to launch campaigns of violence or of any kind of physicality. We have an array of means that we can use in order to bring about the kind of outcome that we all seek. But we must understand our point of strength, and that point of strength is the fact that we represent, I would suggest, and from my own impression, but I think I'm fairly accurate in saying more than 70% of the global population. We're talking about everyone who's been marginalized, everyone who's been suffering poverty, suffering disease, suffering from, corporate tyranny, suffering from brutality, from all sorts of oppression and dictatorships and the such. Where we represent the voices of those who have no means, who have no ability to reach the echelons of power, whether they be in Paris or London or Washington. We represent them, and therefore we are on a very strong keel. But this fight needs a lot of organization, just like what Professor Sami Arian said. A lot of organization. We need that kind of clear vision as to exactly what it is that we want to achieve. And we need to be patient. We need to persevere. We need to endure the sort of turbulences and trials and failings in order to achieve that kind of ultimate success. But the fact is that we were, and coming back to the film that Amir made, we were right. And, just because things have moved on doesn't make us less right. In fact, if anything, events show that we were even more right than we probably even thought at the time when we were speaking to the millions and millions across the globe. So it needs a little bit of more organization from our part. We need more clarity. We need, and I think that the point that Sami mentioned regarding the Palestinian cause, what are the causes that we share, that we agree upon? Let's focus on those, because as we all saw, when we're going to talk about Syria, we're going to, sort of go in different ways. When we talk about Libya, when we talk about Yemen, we're going to go in different ways. But there are things that we all share, we all agree upon. And with us, the 70% of the world population, I believe, that is what makes us strong. Thank you very much at the very end. Thank you for everyone who was part of this. And Amir, once again, and for the millionth time, thank you.
Phyllis, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Anas.
Sure. Well, I'll add my thanks to Amir for the film and to the organizers of the film festival and today's discussion. I think I absolutely agree with what Sami said and what you added, Anas, about the need for real mobilizing that has a long vision and is a long game. We're not sprinting, we're in a marathon. We know that. I think that for those of us who work on Palestine, we also are very aware of the fact that in 70% of the world, Palestine has enormous support. In those parts of the world where the most powerful governments are in power, it does not, because there has been success from those who stand against Palestinian rights, unfortunately. And that's what our work is. And that work continues. And that is part of our long game here. I think that is part of our work. And I think there are a couple of issues that right now are global already, truly global, including both people who live under the worst oppressive conditions in the global south and elsewhere, and those who live in far more privilege in so-called democracies, which have their own issues of massive inequality in the United States, in Europe, et cetera. And one of them is climate. So the question of the COP26 this next week is part of that. It's something that is urgent, that is immediate, and is long-term. So I think that our work on climate that is linked to questions of Palestinian rights is linked to questions of war. We can't leave out the creation of climate refugees that create conditions of war in some places. All of these things are more connected than ever before. The same is true for the question of the rights of migrants around the world. The fact that there is an Olympic refugee team refugee, I cheered for them 4 years ago and this year. And at the same time, I wept with how it reflects the normalization of so many tens of millions of refugees around the world, that somehow that's become normal. And by giving them a team at the Olympics, it makes it okay. So we have huge challenges ahead of us. And our movements, we need to work on all of these movements. We need to continue our work on Palestine. We need to continue to work on stopping wars. We need to continue our work on climate, on stopping vaccine apartheid. We haven't talked about COVID and what it's done to our movements and to people around the world. All of these are challenges. And I will end with the notion that what Amir brings us in showing us the capacity of the world to build a global movement is a kind of model, not exactly, but it's a kind of model of what we need to do for all of our other movements. It's going to take a very long time, but we are looking generations ahead, and the younger people coming up, I have a lot of hope for them. Thank you all.
I'll let you wrap up, I guess, Amir. Another question that we haven't addressed at all tonight is how to enable radical filmmakers to make radical films today. That's and to find the money to make radical films, because it's obviously often a question of money. But anyway, you've got the floor.
Well, thank you. That's an important point, and we make a whole other debates. I'm trying to make a couple of new projects and facing the same battle again. Who's going to fund it? But I've enjoyed this very much, and I'm very sorry that we've lost Colleen. But in a way, what I want to say is that I sort of feel slightly the odd one out, because I'm a filmmaker, and I'm humbled really by the stories of the people who, all of you on the screen, who those who are in the film and those who are actively activists. I don't think I've earned the right to call myself an activist, because I'm not on the front lines. I've told the story, so I hope in future I'll be able to tell that story. But the question, in a way, the title of the film, when I was searching for the title of the film, I remember I read the Shelley poem, The Mask of Anarchy, which has the lines, shake your chains to earth like dew that in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. And in a way, that beautiful poem captures really, I suppose, what I feel is that, if people realize that they really are in the, majority, and when they can come together and unite, it's extremely, extremely, powerful. And that's what I really, I suppose, wanted to achieve, in the film, with the conjunction of what the title is and the story. That's really, I suppose, the feeling I want to kind of leave people with. And I just hope whatever form resistance takes, whether it's protest or BDS or any other form, that good people will prevail. So thank you, Frank, for giving us all the opportunity to be here and talk about this.
Thanks, Amir. Actually, Sami, you wanted to add a few words before we wrap up.
Also end by thanking and saluting and congratulating the Coalition for Civil Freedoms for putting this all together. And I thank you, Frank, also, because you've been a person who's worked very hard in bringing this together. All the filmmakers, Amir and all the other filmmakers, for making these films and starting these important discussions. And when it comes to also this panel, I think this panel has contributed tremendously as the final panel to the path forward. And I wish Colleen was with us. I want to really thank her, because she comes from a background of pain. She suffered, and yet her instinct was not retribution and revenge. Her instinct was how we can make this world better. And I think that's the starting point for all of us. Correct. And I want to, I mentioned Palestine as a global struggle for justice, but also I want to, inside the United States, I want to remind people what this film festival also reminded us over and over again from the first film, The Mauritanian, throughout, about the political prisoners that exist today in the United States, and how we really need to start a movement to make people aware that this exists today in America. And this is one of the sad consequences of the so-called war on terror. And our freedom means nothing if these people stay behind bars while they are innocent. The issue of political prisoners need to be raised, and people need to start mobilizing around it. And I think that's an important thing. I remember back in Secret Evidence, my final point, we part of our strategy, because the material support provision was about to be introduced and used, and we wanted to test it. And I remember David Quinn was in the discussion, at the time, everybody was around the table and said, all right, what we're going to do? everyone is going to donate. We're going to get 1,000 people to donate $1 each to one of these Palestinian movements on the terrorism list, and see what the government is going to do. Are they going to arrest all 1,000? It was this spirit. You know, I remember David Cole was making a joke, I will not do it because you need someone to defend you. so it was, but these are the type of discussions people had, that they were willing to sacrifice, willing to put themselves, you know, not just in protest mode, but also in a case of jeopardy. You know, they're jeopardizing their own freedom in order to make a point and resist. So we need resistance, effective resistance against the government, and where we can make a difference, that will increase, that will probably need sacrifices, but that's the type of struggles that good people, you know, engage in. And I want to thank every one of you for this panel, and also thank the whole, you know, all the organizers for this whole month of very good films. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Sami. So again, thanks a million, Phyllis, Anas, Amir, Sami, and Colleen, who unfortunately sort of dropped out for the last few minutes. This was the final panel of the War on Terror Film Festival, but you can find all the panels on the website, which is wotfilmfestival.com. The festival will stay up. All the conversations will also be on YouTube. There was a film we couldn't show during the festival, but that we will show on November 6th. It's the seminal Battle of Algiers. And we'll have a panel around this film as well. So as Dr. Sami said, thanks a bunch to the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, Lina in particular, Ali as well, Dr. Sami. Thanks to the sponsors of the festival and our partners. And yeah, let the struggle be a joyous and fruitful one, I guess. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well done. Thanks.